Hey guys, Bigstuff3 here. How's it going? So today we're going to be talking about one of the most important sections of every tune-up, the startup and idle section. And why this is so important is because inside here is where you're going to be able to hit that key, whether it's 100 degrees or 30 degrees outside, and she's going to take off, fire off, and run no problem, and run on all your other tables you got programmed in. So without this stuff being configured correctly, you're not going to have a good time starting, and the motor's not going to be happy. So first thing I want to get into is going to be the cranking configuration here, okay? The crank configuration is very simple. We have a number here listed as far as a crank to run threshold. This crank to run threshold means that anything above this number, we're going to be considered running, okay? So if we go above 400 RPM, the engine, the ECU is going to go, oh, I'm in a running state. I'm going to start looking at my fuel tables, my AFR tables, my spark tables, anything else that's running in the normal engine state, it will be on. If we're below this number, we're going to be considered in the cranking state, okay? And that's very important because in the cranking fueling section, it is a raw pulse width number, and we'll get into that in a minute. But until we're over this threshold, which in this case is 400, which is a pretty standard number, we're going to be considered cranking, okay? The crank spark advance is the number that we're going to be cranking at timing wise. So in this case, we're set for 15 degrees. We're going to have about 15 degrees of advance actually on the engine itself. About 10 to 15 degrees is pretty standard for the actual number that we're going to run. Sometimes if you're in a colder climate, you may run a little less to get some heat energy going, so that actually takes off a little easier for pretty extreme cold climates. But 10 to 20 degrees is pretty standard for most combos. It's nice to actually have some timing in there, so that way you're actually making some decent torque to take off and run while you are cranking, okay? So pretty simple table there. Next one here we got is cranking curve. Now, what this has happened, or why this table is important, is because this is the raw injector pulse width that the Bigstuff is going to use to actually input for when you're actually firing off your injector. So this doesn't look at a VE map. This doesn't look at your pounds per hour for your pounds per hour setup on the fuel table. This is a raw cranking pulse width. So this can vary sometimes depending on how big your injectors are, depending on how big your base fuel pressure is, right? This is a raw number. So sometimes you'll have engines that literally will be at 1 millisecond when it's hot, that just needs barely any actual opening time. And then when they're cold, you'll have extremes. You may have some 30 or even 40 milliseconds, depending on how much fuel you're using and how cold it is, okay? So coolant versus cranking pulse width is all this table is, and your ECU uses this exact cranking pulse width value to work from, okay? So if your engine has a hard time starting and it seems like when it fires up it's running rich, you may have to adjust this. If you have to keep the gas open or floor the throttle while you're cranking and then it'll actually light off, okay, that could be an indication that you're actually flooding it out during startup, all right? But this is a decent baseline table. This is a little bit less fuel with this engine combination that it wants, but this is typically in the 5 to 8 millisecond range, usually when motors are warm. But again, it can vary greatly based on base fuel pressure and the type of fuel that you are using, okay? But the bottom line is you always have more when it's cold and less when you're hot, okay? And that's the raw cranking pulse width number. Once we're above that 400 RPM for cranking, then we get off of this table and we start using everything else, okay? If we go to the next section here, we have an after start correction curve. What the after start correction curve here is, this is an amount of fuel that is added to the base fuel map once we actually start the engine. And anytime you fire up the engine, you're always going to give it a little bit more fuel just to make sure that it's going to take off and keep running. Because if the motor's not up to temperature yet, the motor may want some after start fuel enrichment to keep it running properly, so when it transitions off of these tables, everything's purring along nice, okay? So in this case here, it's going to be a bigger number to typically a smaller number when it warms up, and it's looking at the coolant here. So coolant, depending on how warm or cold your coolant is, we're going to have a certain percentage of fuel added to the base pulse width, okay, that is defined in your fuel table, all right? So typical is to have more when it's cold and less when it's hot, all right? The delay curve here, this simply spells out, okay, once the engine state is equal to run mode, The after start fuel coolant correction versus crankshaft interrupts is enabled. The values go from lower to higher based on coolant temperature, okay? So what this simply means is this is a delay of how soon after start is going to kick in. So obviously we're very short up to our 90 degrees. It's going to, after start fuel enrichment is going to start right away. As we get a little warmer, we're going to let it wait a little bit longer before it actually takes off and goes because the motor's already up to temperature. Okay, so this may take some playing with depending on once your motor's actually running, it may need more or a little bit less fuel. Okay, this is the actual delay based on crank interrupts. All right. Then we got a decay curve. The decay curve simply means that once the engine's actually running, this is going to be how fast it actually decays out based on crank interrupts. Okay, so typically we're going to go from lower to higher. This engine's got some extreme numbers down here, okay, but you're typically mainly going to run from a lower to a higher number based on coolant temperature. Typically when the motor's warm, you're going to have it phase out a little bit slower versus cold, okay. That's how this table works. And sometimes if the engine starts going a little lean and closed loop is throwing a bunch of fuel in when you first start, that's how you'll know you have to actually throw a little bit of decay on there, because the goal is to keep that air-fuel ratio constant no matter whether you are just fired the engine up, no matter whether you're warming up. You're going to hit your AFR target. Usually most times we want a little bit richer AFR when we're colder versus warmer as well. So this is where you'll play with how fast the after start enrichment is taken away. Okay. The next section we have here, which is really important, is the after start parameters. And why this is important is because there's two things here. We have an engine coolant temperature after which the warm time after this time is enabled. Okay, so after 180 degrees, we're going to look at this value, which is set here. Okay, the amount of time the engine fueling starting settings will be delayed to prevent overfueling during repeated hot starts. So what that means is if you're in the staging lanes or you're in traffic and for some reason you just keep on turning off your engine, by default our ECUs come with a 60-second number. So what that means is when you turn off your ignition switch, your ECU is going to stay alive for 60 seconds. So let's say at 45 seconds you turned your ECU back on, you want to crank it again. The after start enrichment tables are not going to kick back in because the engine was just so recently started. You shouldn't need any after start enrichment because it was just running. You don't have to apply the after start parameters again. Okay, so if you're a race car guy though, you want to make this very small. I recommend setting that to 1 second, because what happens is, let's say you're making a bunch of cal changes or you're a calibrator, you're making a bunch of changes for a street car. If you set this to 1 second, the ECU, when you turn off the ignition, is going to turn off and power down and will then be off. So if you're making changes to areas that require restart a lot of times, like the generic port editor, or if you're making changes in the dealer settings, then you're going to want to go in here and make this one. This way, the ECU turns off right away. You're not waiting for that 60 seconds, because if you have a 60-second delay in there, you're turning off the ignition, trying to make changes, and it keeps coming back up and your changes haven't actually been made, more than likely that's why. So set that to 1, turns off the ECU right away. Even if it's a street car you're working with, you want to have this enabled just during your calibration setup and your tuning. Make it a 1. That way it shuts off fast. Then when you're all done, put this back to a 60 or however long you want it to make it. That way it doesn't start after start enrichment when you're all done. Okay? Our next section here is this all has to deal with running the idle correctly and having your engine idle at your engine idle target. Okay? So the first thing we're going to have here is a desired idle curve. Very simply put, you're going to have a coolant temperature and you're going to have an idle RPM with it. So pretty standard stuff. When you're colder, you're going to have a higher RPM. When we're hotter, we're going to have a lower RPM, okay? So the ECU is going to work in conjunction with your IAC motor and idle spark to get to this idle speed, okay? The most important thing to remember though is on your operating configuration section up in the upper left hand corner, okay, you're going to have a max TPS for idle. So in this case, if we're at 1% or below, we're going to be considered to be running in idle. And what that means is we're then going to allow the IAC and everything to all work correctly to target our idle RPM. If our TPS is actually above 1% in this case, 1.5, 2, 3, 4%, then it's not going to it's not going to go into the idle to actually try to control idle properly. It'll be on your main spark map. Idle spark will not be kicking in. It's not going to work correctly because you've got it set too high. So just don't forget to have this number set to whatever you want it to be, so that when we're below the max TPS number, it knows to good now target and move your idle or control motor, idle spark, and everything to actually hit your actual target. Okay? So if we go back into IAC start position curve, this is a very simple curve here. You have an IAC motor. If you're using it, race car application may not be, but if you have a street car or if you have a setup that is running an IAC motor, this is simply going to be the amount of steps the IAC is going to be open based on when you turn on the ignition versus coolant temperature, okay? So the colder the engine is, the more steps we're going to have. The highest steps you can have on a typical GM motor is about 180 steps, all right? So we're going to have about 127 if we were negative 15 degrees in the coolant. Obviously, that's probably never going to happen for the most part unless you're up in the extremes there in the snow. But most times we'll be down here in this range on startup, okay? And this is going to be how big the IAC motor is. Now, if you fire up the engine's got a big flare. Most of the times, you're simply going to have this IAC position on startup too high. You're going to want to start playing with that, reducing this number so that when you actually fire the engine off, it doesn't have a big flare. If it actually doesn't, if you fire the engine off, it starts to stumble, it doesn't want to take off and actually run, you may have to raise this up. This all works in conjunction with how your throttle blade is on your actual throttle bodies, whatever you're doing. So this may take some playing around and getting used to, but the main thing you want to do is to start adjusting this table when it's hot. Okay, get it dialed in when it's hot, when the engine's warm, and then work your way back. So when you have cold start tuning, you can come out because you know where the engine already wants to be when it's warm, and you can work your way back from there. Okay. Our next table here is the throttle follower curve, and what this simply does is this actually opens up your idle or control motor based on how far your actual throttle blade is open, okay? And what this is for, this is required to keep the engine from stalling when the throttle position changes from some percentage from open to close fully quickly. So if we were cruising around and we were at around an 18 to 24% TPS, we're going to have the IAC motor open this number of steps. Now, if you chop the throttle and you close it, okay, and you go back down 0.5%, the idle control motor is slowly going to go back down to the target to hit your idle, but you may not want it to go too fast, okay, because then the engine's going to stall out. We're going to show you how to adjust those parameters so you can control your IAC speed properly. But you always want to have your IAC open, okay, so that when the TPS is open, so the engine doesn't stall. So obviously, if we were to go to wide open throttle and whack it to 100% wide open, we'd go all the way open to 180, and then we would slowly come back down from there, depending on how the IAC pit settings are, to get your motor to prevent from stalling out. Okay, so a simple table. This is a typical table of where you're going to have a minimum of 5, and we always recommend at least a minimum of 5. You want to get your throttle body adjusted to where the IAC is doing a little something. It's not good to have a 0. You can in there, but if you have a 0 in there, that means that the step motor's all the way closed, and the resolution is not going to be very good as far as running it. Give it a little bit of movement with the 5. That way, it's always got something to work with. So when it starts to crack to open, you're going to start to do something with it. Okay. Come back over here to the IAC parameters, last part of the section. And what this is here, this is the actual control loop for running the IAC motor itself, okay? So you've got a prop gain, an integral, and a derivative. The prop gain is a coarse number, so imagine a coarse piece of sandpaper. That's what this number is. The integral is your medium, okay? And the derivative is the fine, okay? So big changes here will give you a big change in how fast the IAC responds. A slower number here means a lower number here means a much slower responding IAC. A higher number here, okay, indicates a faster responding IAC, okay? So if I put a big number in like 20, it's going to respond really, really, really fast on the prop. If I put a number in here like 2, it's going to respond very, 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 very slow. So all depends on the motor, the cubic inches, what type of fuel you're running, but just really depends on your combo. Most ECU settings will be somewhere around the high teens for prop, mid low teens for the integral and the high eights or nines on derivative. It just depends on the combo. You simply want to watch your IAC position when the engine's running. If it's going really fast and the engine's hunting, you may have to slow these down a little bit. If the engine's actually not responding fast enough, then you may have to increase these numbers so the actual IAC motor is moving around to actually get to your idle RPM targets. Okay, that's how this works. Now, one thing I do want to mention here is, because we're talking about a bunch of idle stuff here, is in the ignition settings, you have a spark modifier selection. And inside here, we have an idle spark. And I love idle spark. Idle spark works great. And what this does is this lets you actually choose a curve based on the amount of error, okay, from the idle RPM target. So obviously here in the middle, I've got zeros, okay? So if I got a zero error, I'm not going to do anything with spark. Now, if for some reason I am 50 below over here on the right-hand side, if I'm 50 below my RPM target, I'm going to stuff 12 degrees of timing in there above whatever is in my base map, okay? If I am over here, though, 300 RPM over, okay, I'm actually not going to pull out any timing. And the reason why is because if I go below a certain TPS percentage, okay, it's always going to try to whack out a ton of timing here, okay? So what I prefer to do is to actually have this big number here so that when I'm way over what would be my idle target, let's say I'm coasting down at, let's say, 15, 20 miles an hour, my TPS is below my TPS idle set point, well, it's going to try to pull out all that timing because it thinks you're idling. So this way, if I get this far away from 300 RPM, in this case, from my idle RPM, it's going to pull out 0. That way, it's not trying to pull out a ton of timing, okay? And that can help out because instead of trying to pull a timing out when you don't necessarily need to, you'll then come to this box. So when I get within 150 RPM now, okay, it'll be allowed to pull 12. Okay, does that make sense? So when I'm within 150 RPM over my set point, it'll be able to start pulling 12 degrees, and then it can interpolate from here to get on your idle target. You don't have to do this. You can actually make this say -12 and -300, however you want to do it. It's totally up to you. But in this case, I like having it so that if I put a 0 here, it will not be pulling the max timing all the time whenever I'm over my RPM, okay? So again, this works with the base spark map. This is for your idle spark curve. It works great. I use idle spark on pretty much everything. There's no reason not to use it, especially on race cars that don't have IAC motors. This works really well, okay? So that's in the spark modifier section, and you turn on or off right here in the idle spark, okay? And that's in the ignition's idle spark curve. All right, so that does it for the startup and idle section. Appreciate you guys taking your time or watch this video. Please share, comment, send me a message if you guys have any questions, and we'll see you on the next one. Thanks for watching.